Hi there, this is Kara Jane with Ice Cream for Buttercream, and this is tips for covering a cake in fondant. Before I show you how I like to cover my cakes in fondant, I thought I would go through some of the supplies that you're going to need to do that. And at first is obviously fondant, and there are several different types of fondants. Probably some of the most popular ones are the satin ice, Wilton. You can use marshmallow fondant, you can use a combination, and there are many more other brands that you could possibly use. So just try a few out and see what works best for you. You're also going to need a large fondant roller and a small pizza cutter. You're going to need a shaker for your cornstarch mixture, and you're going to need some shortening if you're going to be using ganache on your cake instead of buttercream. You'll need fondant smoothers, and I like to have 2 smoothers. And then I also like to use a piece of a plastic folder. It's kind of an acetate kind of material, and I just like to cut a rectangle and then fold it in half. It's really good for buffing and smoothing your fondant. You'll want to have some pins handy, and the smaller the better. And that is for popping any air bubbles that you might have when you roll out your fondant. And then you're going to need a rolling mat to roll out your fondant. So let's talk about the rolling method for fondant. You really want to find the method that works best for you. There's a couple of different popular methods, and I'll go through those real quick for you. The first is rolling between 2 mats. And if you've ever looked up, it's called The Mat, and it's from Sweetwise. And basically you can get different sized mats, and then you put a mat down, you roll your fondant, or actually you put your mat down, you put your fondant, and then you put the top mat over that, and you roll your fondant between those 2 mats. You take the top mat off, and then you put your fondant on your cake. I have used that. It's a little cumbersome for me to use, but there are people who prefer this method. Another way to do it is to just roll your fondant out onto your mat without adding that top mat on it. And then you actually just pick up the whole mat with the fondant on it, turn it over, and then place that on your cake, and then you just kind of peel the mat off. I also find this a little cumbersome, but people like to do that as well. And the third method is the method that I like to use most of the time, and it's just rolling your fondant out onto the table or onto a mat, and then actually just picking up the fondant and laying it onto the cake by hand. And this is the method that I prefer to use. I've used the other methods, and they just, they seem a little bit like there's too many steps, but like I said, practice, use a couple of the other methods and just see what you like best. Okay, and I'll also say that I really like to use ganache under fondant, and I will put a link in the description below on my video on how to ganache a cake. I really like to do that because the ganache gets really firm. It's easier to put the fondant over it. If you coat it in shortening and you make a mistake, or there's a huge air bubble that you can't fix whenever you add fondant to it, you can actually just peel that fondant back off, knead it again, and then try to cover it again. So it's not really messing it up. As opposed to buttercream, if you peel it off, you're going to have to fix the buttercream a little bit. It just takes a little bit more effort. But you can use buttercream under fondant. I just don't like to use a thick layer of buttercream. And if you do use buttercream under fondant, make sure that you're using an all butter buttercream so that it will chill up and it'll kind of be harder. So if you used a shortening based buttercream, it won't get firm enough in the fridge before you add the fondant over it. Okay, so here I have my white chocolate ganache covered cake. And I am just going to add a thin layer of shortening all over it. And I just use a paper towel. You can use a brush if you want, but I just use a paper towel. It's pretty easy. And I do chill it for a little bit in the fridge. You don't have to chill it very long. And I like to actually heat up my fondant just a tad before I knead it. And when I say heat it up, I don't get it hot. I mean just barely heating it up. You don't want your fondant to get really hot, just enough to just warm it just slightly. It just makes it easier to knead and to roll out. And I also like to knead it until it gets really stretchy. Okay, so I'm just kneading it here. And like I said, I like to make sure it just is really stretchy. And then I like to sort of shape it into a disc, a circle if I'm doing a round cake, and then more of a square if I'm doing a square cake. In my shaker, I like to use cornstarch and powdered sugar mixed together. I just use half and half. There are some who don't like to use the powdered sugar. I quite like using the powdered sugar with my cornstarch. So you just use whatever works best for you. And I'm just sprinkling it all over my mat here, and I do use quite a bit. And then I'm just rolling out in all directions. And you want to roll your fondant out to be about 1/8 of an inch thick, or maybe just slightly more than that. And when I roll it, I take into consideration how tall the cake is and what the diameter of the cake is, and I roll it out to be a much larger measurement or width than that. That way I have plenty of room to drape over the cake. You also want to be careful when you get towards the end of the fondant as you're rolling not to push down further, because that will really thin out the very edges of your fondant, and you don't want to do that. You want to keep the same thickness throughout the entire fondant that you're rolling out. Once you've rolled it out, you want to use your tiny needle to pop any air bubbles that you can see. And I actually like to use my fondant smoothers to smooth out the fondant after it's rolled and before I actually add it to the cake. So I'm just taking my fondant smoothers and going a quick once over before I add it to the cake. And I'm just sprinkling a little bit of the cornstarch mixture around the cake so that the fondant doesn't actually stick to the table. Okay, I'm flipping one side up and I'm going to brush some of the excess cornstarch mixture off. And then I'm going to do the same thing to the other side. So I'm just picking up the fondant and I'm going to lay it on the cake. And I try to be careful when laying it on the cake so that I don't get any large air bubbles on the top. And I go around with my hands on the top perimeter, just around the top of the cake, so I get that good and stuck to the cake. If you don't do this first off, it could cause the fondant to sort of pull, and you're going to get that elephant skin, or you're going to get some tears or rips in your fondant. So I like to really attach it really well to the top of the cake first. And I'm just going to go around with my hands first, and I'm just spreading it out, the skirt of fondant basically. You just want to just keep going down as you go, just little bit by little bit. If you try to go too much at a time, you're going to get some pleating in your fondants and some creases and some folds basically. So the further down you go, little bit by little bit, you just want to keep spreading out that fondant skirt. Now, I like to use my fondant smoothers first, and then I'll move to the acetate to smooth it further. And right here, you can also just use your mini pizza cutter to go ahead and do one preliminary cut around the fondant to get the excess off. And then I'm just taking my fondant smoothers and smoothing around the cake. We're going to go around the sides and around the top. Now I'm just going to take my pizza cutter and cut the rest of the fondant off. Using my smoothers again, and then I'm going to switch to the acetate smoother, and I just use a little bit of the cornstarch mixture on the cake, and then I just go around and smooth it with the plastic acetate folder basically. And for some reason it just works really well. It really buffs out any of the cracks or any imperfections. And I just go as long as I need to make sure it's really good and smooth. If you really want the top of your cake to have that very sharp edge, you can use that in conjunction with your fondant smoothers. You can use the fondant smoother and the acetate, or you can use two of the fondant smoothers, and you just go up to each other on the edge, just like I'm doing here. You just want them to meet up against each other. And you can do that all around the top edge if you want a really sharp look. I kind of like mine a little bit rounded on the top and not so extremely sharp. But some people like the really sharp look. And don't forget, don't leave any of your fondant out. Knead it back and then put it back into a Ziploc bag. You always want to keep your fondant covered because it will dry out if you don't. I will tell you, if you mess up or you've got a huge air bubble you can't get out or the fondant ripped, just take it off, knead it up again. If you didn't get too much buttercream on it, or if you're using fondant, that makes it even easier. But just roll out your fondant again and try again. Now, if you've rolled it out the second time and it doesn't work the second time, after you've kneaded it and rolled it out, you may need to use a different fondant or just new fondant, because once you've done that a number of times, the fondant's just not going to work right for you. So you might have to get a new batch of fondant and work with that. And now I'm going to show you how I like to attach my cakes to the bottom cake board. And you can use either hot glue to do that, or you can use, like I'm using here, some Wilton candy melts. And you can use a large spatula to sort of move it into position. And that is it. Now you've got your beautifully covered fondant cake. I also want to say that you have to practice working with fondant. If you've got an event coming up and you're going to do your first fondant cake for that event, you don't want that to be your first time working with fondant. You really want to practice with it, because it is much harder to use than it looks like. It does take a lot of practice. If you can get yourself some cake dummies, you can practice on cake dummies if you'd like. Just cover the cake dummy, the styrofoam dummies, with shortening, just like I did this ganache cake, and then add your fondant to it. Like I said, once you've rolled it out and used it a couple of times, you're going to need to get a new batch of fondant and work with that. Because it doesn't work well if you keep using it over and over again like that. But just keep practicing. You're going to get it. It just, like I said, just takes practice, and once you get it down, you're going to show that fondant who's boss. And don't forget to check out the description below. I have added in some other videos and links that might be useful to you, specifically one about ganaching your cake if you want to use ganache under fondant. And it will show you how I get totally straight lines and a very sharp edges to my cakes. And in the description, I've also got a link to this post that you can check out on my website, and that's going to give you a couple extra details about it, and where you can also grab some really good cake recipes and buttercream recipes to try out. Okay guys, I hope this was really helpful for you. If you have any questions about anything, or if I skipped something or didn't cover something that you wanted to know, just leave me a comment in the comment section below and I'll try to get back to you. Okay, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.